Hey everyone, my name is Brian. Welcome back to my channel. If you're a returning subscriber, you freaking legends. We've got a lot to talk about today, but before we dive in, I do want to set expectations to, I guess, tempered in this regards. We're going to be covering the Final Fantasy XI We Are Vanadiel website that has just launched with some really good information on it, some amazing artwork. Link will be in the description, and this is all building up to the 20th anniversary of Final Fantasy XI. They've said for years they've been working on something quote-unquote big. I'm trying to keep my expectations in the dirt so that even if it is big, then I'm going to be more excited. But even if it ends up just being, just like, hey, we've added another trust NPC or something, not necessarily like ground-shattering or big in my definition, I at least can walk away from the event, being excited that we're celebrating 20 years of Final Fantasy XI. So anyway, we're gonna dive into the website. There's an interview with some information, especially about the development of the website. This is through Google Translate, so if you do speak native to the language, please forgive me and how I might be, I guess, pronouncing things. But just to kind of highlight the website itself real quick, obviously it is just the starter. Today we've got some updates. It looks like the opening of the site, different memories of Vanadiel that people have released, as well as various images and artwork that I would highly encourage you to check out. And Final Fantasy is obviously known for its artwork and style. But let's go ahead and dive into the update for We Discuss Vanadiel. First, Hiroshima Tanaka Part 1. Producer session, we discuss Vanadiel in a special project in which producer Matsu talks with a person who has a connection with Final Fantasy XI. Hereafter, Final Fantasy XI. The first memorial conversation partner was Horigami Tanaka, which is the game director and the director of Final Fantasy XIV 1.0. Obviously, we know how that all worked out, but as far as it goes, that's a long, complicated story. Ask me about it live on stream sometime. We ask a wide range of topics 4 times, including the launch of Final Fantasy XI's project, the creation of a development and operations system, and Mr. Tanaka's production style. So let's start the session. Former Square Enix employee, game producer, and one of the creators of Final Fantasy series. From the start of development to 2012, he has been the producer of Final Fantasy XI. Currently, he's involved in game development as an executive officer and general manager in the development of Gung Ho Online Entertainment. All the triggers are, try it because it's interesting. Matsu says, Mr. Tanaka is my big senior. I am still nervous. And first of all, let's talk about how Mr. Tanaka approached the Final Fantasy XI project. Tanaka says, it's so old that I have a vague memory. In 1996, Square at the time built a studio in Honolulu, and Mr. Saragachi, one of the main creator of Final Fantasy, started making the movie Final Fantasy. And perhaps it was around 2000, because in Hawaii I was working during the day, and there weren't many places I could go drinking at night, like when I was in Japan. So I guess I had nothing to do. Mr. Saragachi was addicted to EverQuest after EQ and said, try it because it's interesting. Did you play with Mr. Saragachi in EverQuest? Mr. Saragachi was adventuring in a guild that had momentum at the time, so the level was completely different. Occasionally he gave me a surplus saying, I'll give you this gift. Even though we are new equipment, Mr. Saragachi was wearing fine golden armor. Is this the first time Mr. Tanaka had experienced an MMORPG? Yeah, I was watching what Ultima Online was like, but I didn't actually play it. An interesting thing here, Ultima Online was played by Yoshi P. That's kind of his introduction to the MMO genre, and obviously Final Fantasy XI is modeled heavily off of what EverQuest was doing at the time. Did the experience at the time lead to the flow of, okay, Final Fantasy is also online? Tanaka said, at that time, it was for the development shift from PlayStation to PlayStation 2. And I thought that the future direction of the RPG would definitely be online. I wonder if the Final Fantasy series will go there as well. However, if you want to develop an MMORPG, it's essential to upgrade it, and with it, it was quite difficult for a home-use game machine at the time, which was based on the premise of ROM, and that the contents would not be updated. At the point, I heard that Sony's Online Entertainment might release a hard disk drive for the PlayStation BB unit, in this case for PS2, and I felt that the development started with the idea that it would be possible to make it. Did Mr. Tanaka convene the development team with the command? There was a company-wide move. I wonder if Mr. Saragachi was calling out to gather members first. The scale of the MMORPG is so large that it can never be done with the scale of an FF team, and that the Sacred Sword Legend team so far. Therefore, the Final Fantasy XI project was launched with 4 to 5 teams joining in. The other big project was because we are going to put in 4 or 5 teams that can make one work. We had just finished developing Chrono Cross, so we started moving first and then invited members to the team that made Parasite Eve 2 and Brave Fencer Masashanen from Osaka to join us, and I got it. At that time, I was on the Holy Sword team and joined early. In 2000, there was a presentation called Square Millennium, and the image illustration of Final Fantasy XI, and at the time was drawn by Kamasaka of the Holy Sword team, and Kato, I'm so sorry, I'm probably butchering names, who was on the Chrono Cross team. And they gave the general story of 11, and I was starting to make it. Certainly, the Holy Sword team had settled down after development of the Sacred Sword Legend Amana was completed, and by the time Mr. Saragachi came to the place where he was discussing what to do with the next project and said, "It's online from now on." It also went to persuade the development members of the Saka several times, and after all, I think that it's difficult to develop at 2 bases. So I asked if I could move to Tokyo somehow. Of course, there were some members who remained in Osaka due to family circumstances. Now, I think Mr. Tanaka was able to move away from Final Fantasy and make new ones after being involved with the first 3 works of Final Fantasy, but then returned to Final Fantasy again. He was easily accepted. Is that how it is? And Tanaka says, I don't really care about the title, whether it was the first Final Fantasy or the second. I made it as a new work each and every time. And then I have to be pulled by the implicit rules of the series and the game's system. It had just ended up being that title. Actually, Sacred Sword Legend 2 was originally designed with the intention of Final Fantasy IV. From there, the 2 works were born, Sacred Sword Legend 2 and Chrono Trigger. In other words, the motivation was to make an MMORPG first, rather than whether Final Fantasy XI is also a Final Fantasy game. And Tanaka says, I agree. I was actually talking with Mr. Sakagachi that if you want to make an MMORPG, it's Final Fantasy. So when it came to whether to give it the name like Final Fantasy Online or something like releasing it as a numbered work in the Final Fantasy series, Mr. Saragachi was stubbornly sticking to numbering. What is that, Mr. Saragachi? Tanaka says, for example, if the title is Final Fantasy World, it will be seen as a spin-off works and not Final Fantasy as the latest mainstream. Mr. Saragachi said that all the time. That's why I argue with the management team. Interesting. That's fascinating. I didn't know that. That's what it means to do an MMORPG seriously. The management wanted to remove it from the numbering later because you cannot play with the PS2 itself, and you have to purchase additional hardware. There's a risk that not all players can play. Meanwhile, Saragachi left Square in 2001, and there were no people who pushed through numbering. However, I had a strong feeling that in the future Final Fantasy series should be online, so I was asked by President Yoshi Wada at the time if I could remove the numbering several times, and in the end, I persuaded the president. During the great period of development, Mr. Tanaka was the one who distributed it because he was also the site director of the Tokyo development, and Mr. Saragachi lived in Hawaii. How much was Mr. Saragachi involved in the development of Final Fantasy XI? At the very beginning, he sent me something like a play diary for EverQuest on a few sheets of A4 paper. I want to make a game like this. It can be said that it is the first and the last. It is something like, thank you for the rest, LOL. I talked a few times in the in-game chat of EverQuest. Mr. Saragachi was all about the release of the movie of Final Fantasy IX. The movie and Final Fantasy IX, But after that, he was more focused on establishing Play Online as an online platform. And it was like running on a so-called social platform, music, online distribution, manga, etc., and live sports. Nowadays, all of them are common internet services, but at the time, they may have been too ahead of the times. I do agree that Play Online was too ahead of its time. It is how it is. It shaked out the way it did. Wasn't Mr. Matsuno confused when he suddenly became a member of the Final Fantasy XI team and then was suddenly told, I'm online now? Matsuna says, House, when I was trying to make the next work as the Holy Sword team, the story of Final Fantasy XI came, but at the time my work was mostly graphic resource management and staff man-hour management. It was at the time when making the games was a little boring. MMORPG is completely different from a game making so far, and it is necessarily devised to display many characters at the same time instead of drawing each one, even if it is graphic and its design concept. And that consensus and communication lag, I was very excited because it was important and I felt like I was back on the production side. The engineer's soul is on fire. However, when I was on the Legend of Mana, I was so greedy for work that I felt like I was going to die. After that, I was planning to work about 50% of my strength and never overdo it, but when I realized I was supposed to write a program, and I felt a lot of trouble again. I'm reading that maybe he was overworked and then he was trying to reduce that time frame. Either way, Matsuna-kan is a planner, but he always writes programs. Well, that's right. Bitter smile. Even so, it was a huge team, and it was the first time Mr. Tanaka and I had such a large number of people. Tanaka says, I wonder if there were hundreds of people, including Visual Works, who worked on the opening movie. Now, Visual Works is the video production department of Square Enix, which specializes in the high-end, full CG videos for the Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest series. Currently is integrated with the Image Arts department, and newly established as the Image Studio department. You led hundreds of them to challenge the unknown genre of the MMORPG, but how did you proceed with team building? Just like we played EverQuest with Mr. Saragachi, first of all, we asked him to play the MMORPG thoroughly. Well, is it still EQ? I agree, for several months, because this is my job. Yeah, that's actually what that's what Yoshi P did. He made his team play World of Warcraft when crafting Final Fantasy XIV. The communication environment at the company was better than at home, so I played at the company for a long time. But at the time, the communication fee was not fixed. The company would pay for it at some extent, but I was almost crying at the time because the monthly bill was around 70,000 yen. By the time Final Fantasy XI came into the service, ADSL had just begun to spread, and in order to form a cooperative relationship with cable TV companies, Square sales teams are flying around all over Japan. It's called the PS2 hard disk, and it's called the constant internet connection, so I was blessed with the timing. When we released the Windows version, it matched the expectation of PC makers and shops, and I remember that the benchmark software for Final Fantasy XI, so-called Tarbench, was an ideal for demonstrations at stores, and I was able to cooperate with them in various ways, and I think it was a great success for me to use the benchmark software instead of so-called demos. The team of Final Fantasy XI is a group of multiple teams, so I think that each of the team had a culture difference. Has anything been done to bring the team together? Since the teams are common language for planners, I think that playing EverQuest has helped me understand that kind of game. I think the graphics people were rather crazy about and how to create an open world on the PlayStation 2. Is there anything that Mr. Matsuno was careful about as the member of the team? And Mott Sidney says, since we have a large number of people, we all decided that the decisions, including the design scenarios and events, that we promised that we would do the rest freely. Therefore, I wasn't used to it. Man, I'm struggling with this last one. Because I didn't know what kind of product would be produced for the culture or how to make it different. However, as for the battle part, I was allowed to do whatever I wanted unless it became very terrible. So, in a sense, I should have done it in a way that was easy for me, and that wasn't a big problem. Part 2 is going to be released on July 14th, 2020. We are Vanadiel. It's leading up to something hopefully awesome. Hopefully something that longtime fans of Final Fantasy XI that share a love of it can be excited about, can celebrate, can talk about, can share, can play, can stream, and all that and the like. But I just wanted to kind of get this out in front of you. Sorry for the struggling of the reading if you're here. It's kind of how it goes. So that's going to wrap up this video, guys. Hopefully you enjoyed. If you did and you feel like I earned it, like, sub, share, clip if that feature's turned on yet. And let me know what stood out to you the most and what you're most excited about or what you would love to see for the 20th anniversary of Final Fantasy XI. For Ginger Prime, my name's Brian. Thanks for watching. Hopefully you have a fantastic day. Hope to see you in my next video. But until then, take care.